Okay. Well, I know it's a little bit early at 12:27. We could maybe start a little bit earlier. We do have some new faces that have joined today's call. Just kind of maybe it might be helpful to do a bit of a quick round of introductions for everybody so they understand who's on the line. And I'll just kind of start with David Fairman. David's with the Department of Water Resources within the Sustainable Groundwater Management Office. He's one of my counterparts under the Facilitation Support Services Program. We had a conversation last week. We were talking about this meeting. He says, hey, my former colleague, Trevor Kent, who is on the line, he's doing a master's thesis on water markets and he just wants to observe. So maybe we can do just a quick round of introductions in the room and then we move on to the phone. Does that sound good? Let's start.
Jeremy, Tulare Irrigation District.
Paul Goldo, East Kaweah GSA.
James Silva, represent several ditch companies in the area.
Joe Cardozo, also represent ditch companies, but I'm also on the GSA stakeholder. I'm the stakeholder rep for the mid-kaweah, greater Kaweah GSA.
I'm Matthew Pina. I'm an environmental economist at California Lutheran University.
Well, we just kind of go down through the top here. Sean Corley, want to do a self-introduction?
Yeah, good afternoon. Sean Corley with Lakeside Irrigation Water District.
Mr. Nichols?
Yeah, Chuck Nichols and Nichols Farms. We're farming and also in pistachio processing and our ag processing representative on the committee.
Mr. Hart?
Yeah, I'm a farmer out of Ivanhoe.
Okay. David, you want to go ahead and do an intro as well?
Sure, David Fairman with the Department of Water Resources, and just kind of a fly on the wall here, keeping the tabs on, what's going on at the local level, especially with regard to water markets.
Diana?
Hi, my name is Diana Zagara. I work with Greater Kaweah GSA.
Thank you. Kendra Clark?
Hi, I'm Kendra Clark. I'm a facilitator with Stantec alongside Kurt Moyle.
Manuel Luan?
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Manuel Leon, and I'm here representing Self-Help Enterprises today. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Mr. Sol Flores?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sol Flores, and I'm also with Self-Help Enterprise.
Trevor Kent?
Hi, my name is Trevor Kent. I'm with GEI Consultants, but I'm also at UC Davis working on my master's on water markets. So I'm looking forward to hearing what's going on in the Basin scale.
Delta View Water Association? A little quick self-introduction, if you could.
Yep, Johnny Gailey with Delta View Water Association.
Bill Swanson?
Hi, I'm Bill Swanson with Stantec. I'm a water resources engineer and planner, helping the team provide guidance on the project.
And Mr. Fukuda?
Mr. Fukuda here, better known as Aaron. Aaron with Tulare Irrigation District, also the mid-kaweah Groundwater Sustainability Agency. And I apologize for being remote, but you don't want me in the room, put it that way. So I'll be remote for this meeting, and I do have to take off a little bit early, so I apologize about that.
And last but not least, Mr. Nelson.
Steve Nelson, Vice Chairman of the mid-kaweah GSA.
Okay. All right, so look at that. I'm gonna pop up the screen. Are you presenting yet? I think you need to present.
Oh,
you have to share a screen.
Your desktop.
Highlighted, so, tab and share. And,
Great. All right, so our agenda for today is to provide some quick updates. The two major agenda items are we're actually going to have at 1:30, we'll be joined by someone from Melbourne who has quite a bit of knowledge of and experience with Australian water markets to share lessons learned in that, sort of what they've learned over the years implementing water markets. And obviously they've been doing it for more than 2 decades. And also we're going to do what we were last committee meeting we referred to as a mapping exercise. We're actually going to look at hypothetical water users, on a map of the Kaweah Subbasin and actually present a series of scenarios and just talk about, what it would take in order to facilitate transfers between 2 water users. What are the things that we should worry about, and what rules and structures do we need to put in place? And the idea is to sort of, we're at a stage in development of the water market strategy where we've surveyed existing water markets. So we're aware of the range of scenarios that are employed already in other basins. And we're treating that as sort of a menu to choose from among. We also agreed to a set of guiding principles. What are the things we hope to accomplish? What do we want to avoid? And we're to the point now where we need to start making decisions about, so what are the things that are most important? What is this? What would a pilot market to be implemented in the next water year look like in the Kaweah Subbasin? And so we've carefully chosen a series of scenarios for that third agenda item to engender conversation about that. And then lastly, we'll talk a little bit about planning for the next workshop, public workshop, which is tentatively scheduled for September 13th. And so that's the basic agenda. To the Stantec team, to Aaron, anything else to add before we jump in?
No, I think we're good there.
Okay, great. Well, you're on deck, Aaron. And so the first agenda item is yours.
Sorry, you were going to get another presenter here in a minute, my son. Yeah, thanks, Matthew. I wanted to provide folks with an update on where we're at with our various GSP revisions and provide some context of what we've been working on for the last 180 days. Many of you may be aware it's been a pretty strenuous exercise to revise, the approaches to our GSPs in 180 days when they often took months alone for each individual section. So hats off to the folks that have committed to that process. We had a real focus group that met weekly to address those concerns. And I'm happy to say that red lines are now being posted across the sub-basin. I believe I saw Greater Kaweah post theirs today. Ours went out about a week ago. I would probably caveat, I know from the mid-kaweah side that we're allowing folks to review those, but we're putting a disclaimer that between versions, there's actually work going on. So if you download it today, keep checking the website because we continue to make minor revisions and they're more grammatical or figure checks and things like that to make sure everything's coordinated. But the approaches are remaining pretty consistent. In our public comment period, I believe the mid-kaweah received 1 comment. Sol, I really appreciate you taking the time to look at our document, provide feedback. We've made some of those corrections and that's been posted there. Next steps, I can say for many of us, really the next steps is we don't have much time, but we're just gonna have to go straight to approval. So I think the schedule is the mid-kaweah will consider adoption on Wednesday, the 20th. Greater Kaweah will be right behind us on the 22nd. and then the East Kaweah will be on the 25th. And then the teams will be scrambling to upload that information to DWR between the 25th and the 27th. Again, hats off to everybody that pitched into this effort. I would say I'm pretty darn confident we're going to make the finish line here on the 27th with a work product that addresses the three issues that DWR asked us to address, which was chronic lowing of groundwater levels, subsidence, and interconnected surface waters. So that's a quick high level update. Are there any questions from the group? Are you guys hearing me okay too?
We are, yeah, you sound great.
Okay,
so
great.
Obviously, this effort to update the Kaweah Subbasin GSPs has involved great efforts by the legal and engineering teams who also have work scoped out in this project. So why don't you share a little bit about what they've been up to?
Yeah, so unfortunately or fortunately, I guess we'll decide in a little bit, is we actually had to take the legal team and the engineering team, and they were part of that focus group that was working on our GSP revisions. However, we were able to parse out some of their time. We've met with the legal team twice. We've developed an outline for the legal chapter, and we're awaiting the work product out of that. I would say that in checking in with them, again, we've asked for their full attention on the GSP. So as after we turn it in, we'll refocus them. They have an outline. The last word I heard was, it doesn't look like it's going to be overly burdensome to fill the legal language into the outline. So I want to thank Matthew and Craig and Condriel for putting together a good outline that they agreed was a good, it's basically the chapter that we need to fill in the details. So they'll fill in the details. From the engineering team, we've met with them once. They've been really socked away in this team that's been working on the GSP, but I would think that Matthew would also agree that in that one discussion, the engineering team focused us on maybe some of the main issues we're going to be looking at here when we run some of these pilot tests. So they're on standby to begin evaluating the policy decisions that this committee makes and helping provide some guidance there. We likely will have to again produce a chapter for them, but that's based upon the information that you folks are requesting. Any questions on that?
Nothing in the chat room, Aaron. So,
Craig, do you want to see if your computer hooks up that?
Sure. I'm not sure when we get into the.
Having a little bit of technical difficulty here in the room. Bear with us for a second.
I need the presentation for me though.
Well, I can just share my screen. As we try and get the projector hooked up here in the room that we're in, we can certainly start talking about the next thing on the agenda item. And so you will recall that it was now a few months ago that we produced a draft, the draft chapter for the existing water markets chapter in the water marketing strategy, and made that available to committee members for comment. We have received comments and from a few individuals, and first of all of these have been collected into a online database that Condriel has put together. And I just wanted to briefly walk through some of these comments for two reasons. One, so that you understand the type of feedback that we're getting on this particular chapter. It's never too late to submit comments if you haven't already, and obviously we will be soliciting comments on future chapters as well. And so here you see one of the recommendations was recommend making a Spanish version available for community residents, especially if it will be reviewed in the public meeting. And so we do hope to review the existing water markets chapter with the public in the September public workshop. And so we will be working to produce a Spanish language version of that. A question that came in the discussion of, the one of the chapters or sections in the existing water markets chapter is about the benefits of water markets, and also what are the things that reduce those benefits. And there was a discussion in there about how the idea of a water market is that by allowing transfers of water, of allocation among water users, that water can use to what the section refers to as the highest valued use. And so the question was, well, what is meant by highest value use? And again, here, this is not it is not the case that as we plan this water marketing strategy that we imagine there is a highest best use of water. Rather, the idea is to try and achieve reductions in water use over time as mandated by Sigma, and to achieve those reductions at the lowest possible cost to water users in the basin. And so the idea is that by transferring water between users, presumably if there is a transfer, it's moving from someone for whom the water produces a lower economic value than the person who's purchasing that allocation. And so it's not here, there is no such thing as a highest value use or a list of highest value uses. We're more interested in creating flexibility so that water can move from relatively lower value uses to higher value uses. And it's really water users that will make that determination. It's not that we're fairly agnostic about that. But for example, if there is a permanent crop and someone needs additional water to maintain their permanent crop in a particularly dry year, right, that might be a higher value use than a rotational crop where the timing of rotations can be slowed. And so that's an example of where there might be a situation where water moves from a lower value to a relatively higher value use. By the way, please interrupt me and if you have comments to add or questions at any time as we move through this. Another a question we got was, are disadvantaged communities considered municipal water users? That same comment indicated that more information needs to be provided about how disadvantaged communities and cities would potentially be able to participate in the market as beneficial users. So the second half of that we hope to address today in one of the scenarios. We'll talk about a project in the mid-kaweah where there's an opportunity for DACs to benefit directly from transfers of pumping. And in terms of whether DACs are considered municipal or some other water use, that is really a question, Aaron, related to the allocation that DACs will receive under the GSP. Do you have any comment on that, Aaron?
Yeah, I think that the traditional definition of a disadvantaged community and that there's a severely disadvantaged community definition relate to average income and other issues that they face. So my immediate answer to that would be, the answer is yes. DAC could be considered a municipality. The prime example of that is the city of Tulare. They qualify as a DAC and they're a municipal water supplier.
Great. Does users only refer to market participants, or does that include every resident community in the valley? Technically, anyone in the region is a water user. So generally speaking, and this is imperfect, but when you read the existing water markets chapter, when we refer to water users, we're generally referring to a market participant in that specific context. We refer in the chapter to water users and to stakeholders, stakeholders being a much broader stakeholders, anyone who might be impacted by a transfer of pumping in the basin. And so generally speaking, water users only refers to market participants. Now, there are examples of water markets where cities are participants, But in that case, it's usually the municipal water authority that's participating in the market on behalf of its residential and industrial water users. So in that case, the city is usually the market participant. There was a comment, you'll recall that we had quite a bit of conversation in this room about the role of price information. And so a comment we received is, I think price information should be shared with the public, but perhaps with not as much detail so that the public can't see who is trading to whom and who is trading to who for those who are interested in observing the market and its effects, right? So the idea is that some degree of price information may be valuable, at least in aggregate, for those stakeholders who are monitoring activity in the water market and who are concerned about unintended consequences.
We have a question from Natalie at Leadership Council. Natalie, you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah,
Raise your
hi.
hand, Ray.
Hi, everyone. Since we're on the topic of like unintended consequences, and one of the reasons why we continue to be weary of, groundwater market scenario is in regards to like DACs participating. And when we talk about DACs, we're usually, referring to much smaller communities, less a city of Tulare, more a Tulio. And, we would, and we'd hope that they wouldn't have to be in a scenario where they would need to enter a market for water resources. And in terms of entering a market for water resources, and this goes not just for the DACs, but, for small farmers competing with the larger farmers for that water resource, we find it that we can't imagine that would be easy for these users, which is why I don't know, the idea of having DACs participate in markets is still something that it's very hard for us to imagine that could be done in a way that would be, again, right, ideally we wouldn't need to have them compete in the market. If ideally a market would be set up in a way that wouldn't actually have to include them competing in it, or if on the best case scenario, right, we would reach sustainability in a way that we wouldn't even have to set up markets. But yeah, just some thoughts on like DACs and markets. It's a pretty scary idea, especially when we are talking communities that are very, very small.
Yeah, thank you for that comment, Natalie. I'll be really interested to hear your comments when we get to one of the scenarios involving a disadvantaged community locally. The vision with that scenario, and I think the vision more broadly, is not that we would, not that disadvantaged communities would be required to participate in the market in order to secure water for basic needs, right? There's an allocation system which addresses that. The intention of the market is really just to create flexibility on the part of individual water users after that allocation. So I also would encourage you to really be engaged in the discussion of the allocation system, how it's determined the water that disadvantaged communities have available to, even before any market activity is engaged in. So I look forward to your comments when we get to that section. So here we have Self-Help Enterprises in partnership with Leadership Council for Justice and Accountability and Community Water Center developed this mitigation framework as a resource for GSAs to develop their own mitigation program. And so this is one, the link is presented here. And this is also something that we will send to committee members so that they have access to that. And that's something we're very, very interested in digesting and including, integrating into our discussion here. So that link is here. This presentation obviously will be available after this meeting, and we'll be emailing the link as well. So stay tuned for that.
I have another question from Sonia Sanchez. Sonia, you have your hand up. You can unmute yourself.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to inform everyone that we've been working on updating the mitigation cost numbers in that framework. The numbers have definitely increased for several of the items since that framework was developed a few years ago. So we expect to have that available next week, so we can circulate that to the board and with you all, the consultants, have that shared. But just wanted to let everyone know that that is something that we're working on currently.
Great. Okay. And obviously, I'll update this link once the revised document's available, so that we have the latest information. Thank you. Another recommendation was recommend adding a subsection on monitoring protocols and system of triggers. And so there is a little bit in the existing markets about monitoring systems, in particular, the choice between metering, in situ metering and satellite remote sensing. But there's not about specific monitoring protocols, right? What is the unit? What's the unit of observation? Over what period? How often is data being transmitted? Obviously, if it's remote sensing, that's every 30 days. And so we can certainly add some additional details about that. The system of triggers is a really interesting one. So how do we respond? How do water users, how do the GSAs respond to unintended consequences of trading as they become revealed, or if they become revealed? And so there, I think this is something we'll talk about very specifically in the context of these concrete scenarios that we're going to present you with later in this meeting. So you see here, they're defining this further as an ability to detect and prevent use of trading groundwater that exceeds the user's allocation. Obviously, it's a fundamental problem if whether or not there's trading, whether people are exceeding their allocation. And then in areas where drinking water is more vulnerable, there's a proposal for higher density of monitoring points or frequent data collection, and then monitoring wells in the shallow aquifer.
Aaron, you have your hand up. Aaron?
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, just to go back one bullet point to add on to the conversation about mitigation programs. The Kaweah Subbasin GSAs as a part of the GSP revisions have, in the reverse development of our chronic lowering of groundwater levels, have taken a protection level approach, meaning the idea is to protect greater than 90% of the all wells. So that's all wells within specific regions. And for that 10% or others that we may not have because you don't have a whole data set, is to provide mitigation for those wells down to the minimum thresholds developed under a mitigation program framework at the sub-basin level. So we agreed to develop a mitigation plan. Here are the elements, and we will do that. We elevated, due to the urgency, the time frame, which was hard to set, but we all agreed that we think we can get to the program by June 30th. Not only did we agree to get to the program by June 30th, but there is going to be an immediate discussion about an interim plan between now and the June 30th development of a program. So look for that coming out. Each GSA is individually talking about the program, East, Mid, and Greater. Mid-kaweah has a ad hoc committee working on that right now.
And then Aaron, will it be necessary to, if we were to start a trading pilot fall or winter, would it be necessary to do one more round of analysis related to transfers of pumping within that mitigation program?
I need to think about that. Put that on the parking lot question board.
Yep.
Good point.
All right, and then Self-Help Enterprises agrees with starting simple, creating an adaptive approach. She agrees with creating a series of pilots. So some of the comments that we received are like this, where the existing markets chapter lays out a series of alternatives. And in this case, she is expressing support for a particular one of those alternatives outlined in the chapter. And then lastly, administratively, it may be more expensive to only authorize the market for 1 year at a time, like Fox Canyon does, but it would also help to discover and respond to impacts to communities. And so just to refresh people's memory, or to let people know who weren't part of the previous presentation on existing markets, in Fox Canyon, it's not only a very robust market with formal centralized exchange and a number of rules to anticipate and mitigate third-party impacts, it also requires annual reauthorization. So the idea that stakeholders had in Fox Canyon was that they were concerned enough about possible unintended consequences of trading that they didn't want this thing to take on a life of its own and just continue to run off the rails if things weren't proceeding as planned. And so there is an affirmative reauthorization step every single year. The GSA passes a new ordinance authorizing it for the next year, and then wherever there have been concerns, there's a process of evaluating those concerns and then making decisions about how the rules of the market should change. There have not been substantial changes in rules thus far. So it's gone, there haven't been major unintended consequences, but nonetheless, that process still exists. So any questions or comments generally about the existing markets chapter, anything that this stirs, any thought that you want to register or question you want to address before we move on and start talking about scenarios?
It's good to go.
Okay. Great. So our guest will be joining us at 1:30. So even though that was the next item on the agenda, well, I think what we'll do is we'll start the scenarios. Obviously, we'll have to interrupt that discussion, go to Chris, and then come back to the scenarios after our presentation and discussion with Chris Olszak. All right, so what we've done here, and this says pilot market exercise, this is more like pilot market scenarios. And so what we've done is we've spent quite a bit of time looking at the map of the Kaweah Subbasin, right? And in fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop sharing the PowerPoint slide here for a moment and actually take you to the Google map that we've developed, rather the Google Earth map. And so what we've done here is, first of all, we've imported important jurisdictional boundaries. So you see here in yellow is the East Kaweah GSA, the jurisdiction of the East Kaweah GSA. The pink or purple there is mid-kaweah and green is greater Kaweah. We also, we have some files on general cropping patterns, critically whether it's permanent or rotational crops. We have things like water district boundaries. So there's a bunch of information here, but I think most relevant to our discussion is we also brought in contour lines for groundwater levels in the basin. Now, interestingly, we've made a deliberate choice for the purpose of this exercise to show you spring 2015. So these are the groundwater contours as they existed in spring 2015. So that's to say, there's no information here about what water levels look like today, right? That's an exercise that we can leave to the engineers to determine. But we wanted to have some baseline of information to start talking about specific scenarios. What would it mean to transfer pumping between users in one part of the basin or the other? And frame that conversation around groundwater levels, right? And potential impacts to groundwater as one input to the discussion. Now, interestingly, when we talked to the engineering team, they said, well, groundwater levels probably not what matters, right? What actually matters more is probably the distance from the groundwater level to the minimum threshold, right? So for example, in the east part of the Kaweah Subbasin, where the aquifer is much shallower, you might have groundwater levels that are just 20 or 30 feet above the minimum threshold because the aquifer is so shallow. Likewise, to the west, there's regions in the mid-kaweah where in 2015, groundwater levels were 120 feet above minimum threshold. And so that the difference that the engineers tried to highlight, that one difference that matters critically between pumping locations is actually the distance from the minimum threshold. And so again, these are just hypothetical scenarios. I'm going to go back to the, actually I'll zoom in on this first. And so the first scenario that we're going to show you is here in the far west part of the basin. So when you look at the groundwater contours, you notice some interesting things, like right here in 2015, in this area in the central portion of the map on the, to the north, there was a local pumping trough, right? At that time, back in 2015, there was also a local pumping mound just to the east. You see other features here in the mid-kaweah, a local pumping mound in the southern central part of the mid-kaweah, and then a local pumping trough in the southwest corner of the mid-kaweah. And then in the westernmost portion of the greater Kaweah in 2015, there was a significant groundwater gradient. So each of these lines shows where the points on the map have the same groundwater elevation. And then of course you see here, because the lines are close together, that that the depth, the groundwater is declining steeply in that part of the basin. And so the first scenario, that was an area that just seemed logical to focus in on. And so what we did after talking to the engineering team, though, was to import a separate set of contour lines that show the GSP designated minimum threshold. And so just to give you a sense what we're looking at here, here we have a hypothetical water user who happens to land on the this contour line, which is where the water level is 100 feet above sea level. So when it says 100 there, that means that the groundwater level is 100 feet above sea level, right? So it doesn't even tell us how deep it is. We could calculate that obviously by looking at the point on the map and its elevation above sea level.
Go for the elevation that's down in the lower right corner.
Yeah. So for example, I can't see that.
It's 218 is the elevation.
Yep. And so that means here in 2015 was about
118 feet.
Yeah. So the depth to groundwater was about 118 feet in 2015, spring 2015. Right. We also have here a minimum threshold where the contour level is 20 feet, right? And so that means if we are, and that is 20 feet above sea level. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint presentation and focus in on this scenario. Right, and so now you see that same region, and we have three hypothetical water users, one who's up gradient, groundwater level gradient, one who's sort of in the middle of that gradient, and one who's at the bottom, right? And obviously this is a, in terms of physical distance, this is a fairly short distance between the three water users. And you see over here on the left, the relative data on those hypothetical water users, again, back in 2015. So we had a groundwater level of 100 in this topmost point, declining to 40 feet and then to 60 feet below sea level. And at that time in 2015, this water user at the top was about 80 feet above minimum threshold. This one in the middle, the groundwater level was about 20 feet above minimum threshold. And then this particular hypothetical spot on the map was 80 feet below minimum threshold in 2015. And so, some of the, what we want to talk about now, and I probably should have had this further out, you'll recall that we developed a set of guiding principles. One of the goals of the water market is to provide flexibility to water users to comply with changing water availability. One of the other ones was to do no harm. And so there's sort of a natural tension. So the water market strategy should anticipate and avoid adverse impacts to water users and uses. And so as we consider this hypothetical situation, there's sort of a natural tension between providing the maximum degree of flexibility to water users and the desire to do no harm. And so we sort of wanted to talk, first of all, just collect general, what are your thoughts about transfers between these three water users? So I'll leave it pretty wide open. You have somebody that's well above minimum threshold, someone who's close to it, someone who's below it. And the question is really what's the right balance of flexibility and mitigation of adverse impacts given these three, and how would you feel about transfers between participant A and B, between participant A and C? And how would you feel about transfers in the reverse, from C to B, from C to A? So without giving you any more structure, what are your thoughts about this scenario and how we go about trying to build rules around transfers? Yeah, please.
Now you said, maybe I misunderstood, but I thought you said they were rather proximate to each other, correct? Those three entities there.
Yeah, and I can tell you exactly how far they apart. And obviously that relative distance may be in the eye of the beholder. So you tell me if you think this is proximate or not.
Okay. Well, as you're finding that, and my second question is how was the minimum threshold developed? What was the predicate that they used to determine that this particular person here, given that they're all, none of them are up against the foothills, or like in the East Kaweah, where we know that they have limited, drilling ability and so on. Whereas over there, my understanding is that there really aren't those many restrictions and so on. There's a lot of deep water, if you will, down below in those areas out there. So that's my first question is based on how did you come up with those minimum threshold amounts for those given areas?
Aaron, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah. So good question, Joe. That's the reverse of we had to reverse the approach. So the minimum threshold charts you're seeing today are the new revised minimum thresholds being submitted to DWR next week. The way those were developed was a two-pronged analysis. The first prong is to take a look at protecting 90% of the existing wells that were drilled since 2002. So ensuring that those wells are maintained to the bottom of the well. The second trigger was to ensure that the wells could withstand the current decline in groundwater levels and the steepness in those. So essentially protect greater than 90%. So whichever was higher. In almost all of the minimum threshold calculations, the values stayed the same or moved up just a hair. So what was originally projected as far as, well, let's just assume this thing is allowed to continue for 20 years, was very close to where protecting the 90% was, because a lot of the new wells have been drilled since then, and then we'll mitigate for the rest. We are also developing an upper aquifer, lower aquifer differentiation to a certain extent. But generally speaking, Joe, the job of the minimum threshold is to protect our current well network and maintaining those into the future. It is not to allow continued overdraft of the groundwater system.
Okay, so let me respond to the question then. So if you have, you're saying 90% of the wells. So if you, for example, are located in a vicinity of it could be a DAC, or it could be, some sort of a new development or something like that, where they've punched a number of shallow wells, if you will, and not gone into the deep aquifer as most of the irrigation wells would have done, then you could have an irrigation well and not be able to, who's drawing from the lower and be affected dramatically by the numerous shallow wells that were dug recently.
Well, you're exactly right. That's why we're trying to differentiate between the number of wells above the clay and below the clay and develop a kind of a more elaborate approach to that. It's actually ending up that we're going to run the reverse scenario, where we're going to start looking at actually, if you look at all of our recharge activities, where all the water is getting placed, it's getting placed above the corker clay, right? So we're going to protect those shallow wells with the recharge activities.
Hey, Sophie, you have your hand up?
I do. Aaron addressed some of it. This comes out of the basin planning with the wells. And I think that we have to look at all of our commitment to not have the shallow wells go dry. And if there's no water there, then it doesn't matter, because a lot of that water has to be replenished. And that's what we're working on doing. But if it doesn't happen, then the deeper wells are definitely taking groundwater that has to be moderated. And their wells still have to be above the minimum threshold from where they are to the water.
So Aaron and Sophie, I have a follow-up question just for clarity. So obviously I'm hearing about the upper aquifer and the lower aquifer. Is there actually an aquitard? Does water not translate?
There's a thick layer, what they call the Corcoran clay or the E clay. And not to confuse everybody, but what we're finding actually is that chronic lowering at groundwater levels won't control. It will be subsidence that controls, because the lower aquifer pumping is causing more undesirable results than the chronic lowering of groundwater levels. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's what we're finding is before you get to a minimum threshold on chronic lowering of groundwater levels, you'll probably reach a minimum threshold on subsidence. Our ground will have subsided because we're dropping about 1 foot a year right now during the drought.
Yeah, Aaron, this is Bill. Let me add a little bit to that from a quasi-technical perspective. What contributes to subsidence through the compaction of the Corcoran clay is the depressurization. So as the water levels below the Corcoran clay continue to go down, the pressure that's kind of holding up that clay also decreases. And then the weight of the soil above it is what compresses the clay, and that causes compaction of the clay, and then it manifests as subsidence on the ground surface. What the researchers are finding is that when water levels below the Corcoran clay are restored to greater levels than what might have caused the subsidence, there might be a slight rebound. Not a lot, but a little bit. If you have feet of subsidence, you may have inches of rebound. But the more important thing is that when water levels are taken down below the historic lows, it reintroduces more subsidence. And so the wells that are already able to operate, because they're deep enough, many of them will continue to be able to operate with lower groundwater levels. But as the water levels have dropped below historical lows, it will induce additional land subsidence, and that's likely to be the trigger for the controls.
And are you losing, when you have subsidence here in the Central Valley, are you losing available storage? You know, it's gone and you actually have less pore space to put water?
Not because the Corcoran clay doesn't store a lot of water. It drains so slowly that it doesn't really produce a whole lot of water to the wells.
Storage assumes that you can fill it back up. So it's not truly a loss of storage. It's a one-time loss. Yeah,
great.
Now, but the other thing is though, is the Corcoran clay is shown by those flights and so on, is rather patchy, especially as you get along closer to the 99. It's hit and miss, and so you've got this.
Well, yeah, Joe. What we're also finding is that in all reality, it's probably not. We're still trying to figure out: is it the Corcoran clay that is collapsing, or is it the interbedded clay layers below the Corcoran clay? Because we found quite a few interbedded, a network of clays below the Corcoran clay.
Yeah,
and so we believe that it's the interbedded clays, not the Corcoran clay, that's collapsing.
And so Aaron, back to this issue of the separation between the upper aquifer and the lower. If there's a disadvantaged community in the neighborhood of these pumpers who are pumping in the shallow upper aquifer, and there are transfers of pumping in the lower aquifer between water users, do we need to be concerned? So does a transfer of pumping in the lower aquifer potentially impact the upper aquifer?
Yeah, I mean, that's a question you just hit on one of the, we got to get the engineers working on that.
Okay.
I would say what we're seeing today is Paul Hendricks and I thought that we had punched the clay so many times that they were operating kind of as one, meaning if you depressurize, they start feeding each other. Jeremy and I now have 5 or 6 monitoring wells above and below the Corcoran clay. What we're finding is they are not as connected as we thought. They respond differently. So yeah, what happens if a disadvantaged community Yeah, if you transfer a lower aquifer credit, will it impact a disadvantaged community? Good question. We need to run that to ground.
Okay, and so obviously, so everyone knows, one of the purposes of this exercise is to do just this. So to express concerns, and also to make lists of questions, right? Maybe there's concerns that we can put to bed. So fundamental question is there an effect of transfers of pumping in the lower aquifer on the groundwater levels among shallow wells in the upper aquifer, right? And so that's a question we'll take to the engineers.
Well, and I think if you were looking at exchanges, maybe something that needs to be taken into consideration is, are we going lower to lower, lower to upper, or vice versa?
Yep. Yeah. So in Fox Canyon, we have decided, and in Fox Canyon, there's actually as many as 3 aquifers on top of each other, depending on where you are in the basin. And we have chosen to be agnostic about where the water is coming from. So when, the depth to pumping in the place that's sending allocation relative to the place that's receiving it. And we have just chosen an adaptive approach. Well, we'll do these pilots and we'll learn over time. But yeah, that is an interesting question.
Here, you're going to have many, many more aquifers than just 3. Reality. I mean, it's a matter of how big a sand or gravel strata are you going to consider to be a strata, be an aquifer? Because
well, Joe, I think it comes down to what we're seeing is there's a confined and unconfined, and then what we call the single aquifer. So there's 3 general geologic systems, and I think that Joe's right. We're gonna have to figure out lower to lower, upper to lower. We'll just have to. That's a very interesting question, and I just wanted to add on top of that, it's not about transferring. It could be. We now enveloped another minimum threshold chart we need to put on here. Is what's the subsidence minimum threshold? Can we transfer and create more subsidence in an area that is experiencing subsidence? So if I got a big red dot, very interestingly for context too, if you notice how those contours are sloping off, if you go to your Google Earth map, you'll see those, it's a concentric circle into a big hole. And you'll see what that hole centers around. Right? See the concentric circles circling around a hole?
Around this area, right? Which is in a different subbasin.
And that's a well field. So.
Aaron, there's a question from Chuck Nichols, and here it's probably for you. How do the gradient levels shown relate to subsidence? Is this known?
It is, and I think it really is. Again, this group's like, man, I wish we had the engineers here. This would be basically getting everybody teed up, but we need to put the subsidence chart on overlay on top of this, and you would see that concentric circle corresponds to the highest subsidence rate also.
So you can use groundwater levels or the gradients as a proxy in most.
No, yeah. So, okay, that's where you're going. So the answer to that, interestingly, is no.
Oh.
You know what governs that is the presence of the clay.
Okay.
Not we thought that we could find a correlation between the groundwater levels and the subsidence. And every time we ran that analysis back in 2020 and currently, it just blows up. So
you really need to be using 2 different sets of parameters in order to look at direction and distance of transfer, correct?
Sure sounds like it.
It sounds to me like you probably have some sort of a correlation in between. If you're going to look at it, in a given area, you say we have this much saturated clay, say to some number, 1,000 feet or something. Okay, we have this much footage of clay. We have this much we have this water level here. In other areas, maybe there's much less clay. Half the clay, it could conceivably lose, much more water because it has less clay to then affect the subsidence. Is that correct? In other words, if you're in an area that has high amounts of clay in it, given large aquifers of water, but if it has large amounts of clay that are subject to drying, then obviously that's an area that you need to be more concerned about for subsidence purposes. If I'm hearing Aaron correctly, right? Because it's a reduction in the clay, the saturation of the clay, the drying of the clay that causes the subsidence. And so if you happen to be an area that doesn't have a lot of clay, if you will, versus the other, would that not make a difference?
Yeah, Joe, I think that's what you and I are saying, the same thing. Yes.
And so, Aaron, I also think it's interesting. I thought it was interesting that the minimum thresholds are here roughly perpendicular to the
gradients.
Groundwater, yeah, to the gradient. Is that, again, that's just a function of, what is that a function of?
That's a function of you putting the two together, and we haven't.
Oh, okay.
It was very interesting to see that. I haven't spent any time to think about why that occurred, but
okay. So then let's make the big caveat that, remember, this is 2015 water levels. Minimum thresholds are correlate to more recent conditions, right? Or no?
Yeah, no, good point. And like we talked about, I think you might have mentioned too, using the 2015 is pretty darn close to where we're at today anyway. If not, we're below that by 10 or 15 feet, generally speaking.
Okay.
2015, 2016 was our all-time low, and we bottomed out, and then we came back up, and we're now back generally below that. So,
okay. So I still would love to hear other comments or questions, but one fundamental question is, so how do minimum thresholds, and we now know we need two, one for subsidence minimum thresholds and groundwater level minimum thresholds. How do we incorporate minimum thresholds into the rules of the market? So to go back to this scenario, is the minimum threshold the binding constraint? Pumping cannot be increased. You can't transfer pumping into an area that's below the minimum threshold. So how do we go about incorporating minimum thresholds? Or do we want to, so that would put more emphasis on the do no harm part of our guiding principles. That reduces flexibility on what, if you're a water user whose groundwater level is below minimum threshold, you will not be able to receive a transfer pumping. Or do we want to emphasize flexibility, and how do we resolve those two? Hey, and Aaron, will you talk briefly about you're allowed to go below minimum thresholds as long as over time, on average, you're above them? How does Sigma treat minimum thresholds?
So yeah, you're allowed to go below the minimum threshold, but you have to at some point bring it back above the minimum threshold. And regardless of the minimum threshold, we are operating to the measurable objective. So you actually have to come back up to the measurable objective, not just the minimum threshold. And that there is no time period on that. It's just a kind of a recovery period. We're hoping you could do it within a 5-year period or so.
Sophie, you had a comment? You're gonna unmute yourself.
The whole point about Sigma to begin with, all the rules that are coming out, is that we have to look at do no harm. That's why all these rules came up. If we're not going to pay attention to do no harm, we're just flouting the entire reason we're all together. And I think that we have to think about that. That's the basis of everything that's happening at the state level on water.
Yeah, Sophie, that's a very good point. It's very complicated when we say do no harm. It's which side do we do no harm to? And so I think it's I'll be very honest, it's not do no harm, it's minimize the harm, because there's harm all the way around, right? We're going to cut back on things. We're going to have to, Mother Nature isn't being too cooperative lately. And so I think we're trying to strike the balance to minimize the harm. And that's what I looked at Sigma is, it's to avoid the undesirable results and give you 20 years to do so. But between there and 20 years, it's probably going to hurt. It sure feels like to me it's hurting.
Yeah, but the question is, do we lean more toward flexibility and independence, or do whatever I want, or do no harm? And my feeling is very strongly that everything we're working toward is trying to do no harm, so we don't end up like the Owens Valley.
Yeah, and I think that's what the water market is doing, is saying, hey, before we transfer a credit of water, up gradient, down gradient, left, right, hey, check to make sure that we're not going to put ourselves out of the way. And if there's really not going to be any risk to that, and we can provide some flexibility, let's go ahead and provide some flexibility. It's giving a carpenter the tools in order to build the masterpiece.
And just to refresh everybody's memory too, there's a number of ways to address. So one is to, create a management area, draw a line where the groundwater level is where the minimum is at the minimum threshold, and say no additional pumping can be transferred into that area. So there's a management area approach. There's also directional restrictions. You could say you can only transfer pumping up gradient. You can't transfer pumping down gradient. There's also exchange ratios. Well, maybe if that grower in the bottom left-hand corner here is really, really, really desperate, really needs additional water to finish a crop or to maintain a permanent crop, they can purchase additional pumping, but they're going to need to retire more than 1 acre-foot up gradient for every additional that they pump. And so there's at least 3 different approaches to trying to incorporate minimum thresholds into those rules.
There's a comment here in the chat room from Sean Corley. Would the 30+ management zones come into play? You want to elaborate on that any further, Sean, or Aaron, do you want to respond to that?
I think that a future scenario by Matthew is going to highlight that, right? When we say management area generally or generically could mean an irrigation district, Matthew. So you've got a sample of that, right?
Yeah, so and just so everyone knows, Chris is going to join us any minute. So we're going to interrupt this conversation as soon as he joins us and rejoin it on the other side. But management areas are generally, though, tied, at least in Fox Canyon and in other places, tied to what Sigma refers to as minimum thresholds and measurable objectives. They're usually not tied to jurisdictional boundaries like an irrigation district, right? So as they're normally employed, and remember, they're employed in the Twin Plant Natural Resource Conservation District, they're employed in the Edwards Aquifer, they're employed in Fox Canyon. They're actually tied to hydrological outcomes, not to jurisdictional boundaries generally. We will have a scenario around districted versus undistricted water users, but I don't know that that's necessarily entangled in this issue. Do you disagree with that, Aaron?
Yeah, no.
I would just add, I know in the east, our management areas are tied around most of the districted areas with some groundwater only in between some of them. And then within the management areas, there's threshold regions, and that is what's tied to the MTs and MOs.
And I did want to share, and again,
Do we have another question here from Chuck Nichols? Chuck, do you want to talk to yours, or do you want me to read it?
No, I guess in follow up to this do no harm discussion, I appreciate that there needs to be a balance here from water and from economy and impacted communities. But one of the things that makes it very difficult for me to look at that graph and say, how do we build a set of rules based on these 3 data points, is we're about to have an enormous change in that a lot of pumping is going to be restricted. And all other things being equal, if we changed only that, these contours might look a whole lot different 5 years from now. And we don't know, and I don't think I would challenge the engineers. I know we have very good ones, and Craig is very good. I don't think he has any idea what's the impact of that is going to be. So whatever we do, I think needs to be broad brushed, and it also needs to be iterative. It can't be, we're going to put these rules in place and they're going to be there for 20 years. We need to do something, but I wouldn't get into our panties too much in a bunch about it, because we're going to be sitting here having the same discussion 10 months or a year from now, or some other group of people will be. So that's, I guess, my question and comment is that the direction, is that the philosophy that we want as a group, instead of trying to get into too much minutia, or just create some broad strokes here so that we can actually test this.
Chuck, this is Aaron. Let me just chime in on you're absolutely right. The subsidence thing is more complicated than any of us could have even imagined. We thought of when we started Sigma. In the GSP revisions, let me just provide context. We probably evaluated 4 to 5 different approaches to subsidence. And the one we landed on was guided by DWR's direction. And so we're complying with what DWR wants, but we're still not, it's a very complicated, there's nothing linear about it. And like what they're finding is, okay, even if you were to stop pumping, like Bill alluded to, the latest science is you don't stop subsidence at all. It actually continues. So that's all I'll add. I think your other question is a definite policy question.
Trying to do that now.
And I guess the only thing I would add to that is the downstream GSPs are going to have a very big impact on what happens in this corner of the world, probably bigger than any policy that we set.
One thing I will add to that is Chuck, luckily we did coordinate with our neighboring GSA to the direct northwest. So we're coordinated on that front. So on subsidence.
Yeah, so Chuck asked an important question I think committee members should weigh in on. So what's the right balance? What's the right balance? How do you incorporate minimum thresholds, measurable objectives into a trading scheme?
Well, don't they have to be compatible? I mean, we were doing all of these plans that we're submitting to DWR about maintaining the well depths with minimum thresholds and objectives, and we're saying how we're going to do that. Are we just going to ignore that as a marketing thing? That doesn't make any sense to me, or I'm missing the question.
I didn't say ignore.
I said minimize.
So elaborate, Chuck. So what's the right balance in your view?
Well, I think that there certainly needs to be parameters, and short of anything else, geographic, or distance probably makes sense. And if you overlay that with some of this data that you have, either from subsidence and minimum water thresholds, you can carve the whole basin up into, I don't know if it's 10 zones or 20 zones or 5 zones. And you set that, and at that point you say, okay, we're going to do this for a year, and we're going to come back and say if we saw negative consequences or we didn't see negative consequences, and we can either loosen it or restrict it from that point. That's the balance that I would recommend.
Sophie, do you have a reaction to that?
I do. I just, it depends on how you set those. If you're gonna set the parameters for the pilot test in a way that could be very detrimental, and you're just gonna say, well, we'll wait and see in a year, I'm not okay with that. If we took and used an establishment of, we're gonna test this for a year, and we chose broad brushes that are reflective of what the GSAs are finding for well protection, I'm okay with that.
I would also suggest that what Chuck is suggesting is ultimately what a GSP is defined as. Our plans are considered adaptive management, so they're, the first shot, and we're going to refine it from there. So I think it stays within the theme of Sigma, is start wide and narrow as you move along.
Hey, so
I'm okay
so one.
Just depending on
Go ahead,
where
Sophie.
you start it. I mean, that's the big thing. I mean, that's what Sigma has really struggled with in terms of the 5-year increments and the slow guide and all that stuff. But it has to be reasonable to start with, I think.
So one approach to mitigation would be to shorten the distance, have one rule that applies across the entire basin. There's a distance across which transfers are allowed, right? But that, for example, might allow pumping to be transferred, downgraded, and even transferred into an area below the minimum threshold. But that's certainly simpler than carving up the map geographically. Whereas if you carve it up, you do the exercise, if you just laid down a contour wherever groundwater levels were below the minimum threshold, that would allow some water users to transfer pumping substantially more than the distance limit, and actually create greater flexibility. So there is a trade-off there between simplicity. You can treat minimum thresholds two different ways in that case. One is more work on the part of the engineers, and the other one is simpler. It's a simple rule, the distance regulation across the basin.
Well, according to Aaron, there are two things though that we need to be concerned with.
Yes.
The depth of water and the subsidence.
You're right.
So then you would almost have to use both parameters.
Sure.
But the other thing is we know, I've been told that subsidence is going to continue to occur even if we stop pumping right now. It's still going to continue to occur. So then do we say, okay, if the subsidence exceeds what the trending line is, do we use that as a kind of a, the benchmark? Because if this has been trending down 6 inches every year for the last 10 years and so on, and we still went down, but we only went 5 inches before, you see my point. We are turning it back. So, but do you not allow it because of that? So, I mean, it becomes very, very complicated, and if you have a combination of the two, or you have a little bit of subsidence and you're right near the minimum threshold. So does that compound itself and say, okay, you can't? I go back with Chuck though. I think, the do no harm thing means to minimize as much harm in both directions, if you will. For those who are still trying to ease their way into different arrangements and so on, and those who are maybe having to deal with dropping water levels.
The only thing I had to add, and sorry for joining late, in my opinion, native should have the most flexibility and maybe some of the surface water credits, because native is native to the basin as far as movement goes. And quite frankly, until all three of GSAs are allocating down to native only, it's going to be really hard to make an argument that transfers of water into an area is what's causing the additional harm, as opposed to continued over allocation of water above the native or sustainable amount.
That's a very interesting point. Any other thoughts or comments? So I do want to point out some interesting other patterns in the basin, which is that, the engineer's emphasis on minimum thresholds was revealing. In this part of the east side of the basin, you'll notice that here there's a region where the slope of the minimum threshold is steeper than the slope of the groundwater levels. So this is a shallow part of the aquifer. And you can see here that they're closer together, meaning that that minimum threshold is declining more rapidly. And so here, the groundwater gradient is downhill, just as you would expect from east to west. So this is higher groundwater levels, this is lower groundwater levels. But interestingly, if you look at depth from groundwater level to distance from minimum threshold, the gradient actually runs the other way. This particular well actually has more water above the minimum threshold than this well, but than a well in this area would. And so that's where that minimum threshold proves to be pretty important information. So in terms of this group, the committees needs to make a decision about how to proceed. We're going to make a set of recommendations for a pilot market. And so eventually we're going to have to decide, in a pilot to be implemented later this year, what are the restrictions that would be put on trade? Is it simply because, as Craig made the point, because we're over allocated, everybody is pumping water that's over pumped, that we're going to allow greater flexibility and more transfers, because it will be hard to argue that the transfer is the thing causing an outcome. Are we going to, I think Chuck's was more in the middle. Soapy is a more minimum threshold oriented approach. We will need to make a decision and advance a recommendation to the 3 GSAs. So any more thoughts on that at this point, or comments?
This is Aaron. Can I paraphrase what I'm hearing from Craig is the policy needs to define what is being transferred. Is it native?
He made two comments. So he said transfer native only. Yeah, and we'll get to that. I think we'll get to that question when we look at the districted, undistricted example.
Well, not so much just native only. I just think to me, native is native to the basin, so there'd probably be less restrictions on that. The banked surface water type stuff may have, a different set of rules, and then any kind of carryover credit, especially credits from like this transitional water, may definitely have some tighter limits on it, because it's not really, the GSA's allocating it out, but it's not like it's their water. So I don't mind having maybe some more restrictions on the transitional stuff, but I'd be a little looser, a little more forgiving on the native and surface water moving around. That's where you get into the flavors.
Yeah, and in terms of the flavors, and I imagine this varies geographically, but generally speaking is foreign and salvaged. Are they in the upper aquifer, natives in the lower aquifer, or not necessarily? They can be anywhere.
Depends on if you're inluing your native and turning it into a inlued surface supply.
And we're going to pause the conversation here because I believe Chris is with us.
Want to unmute yourself and turn on your webcam, Chris? There you go.
Yeah. Hello, everyone.
Hey, Chris. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. I was just checking my camera. I was meant to start in 15 minutes.
Would you like 15 minutes, or are you ready to go?
I'm ready. I'm ready to go if you guys are.
Let's do it. Great. Okay. And so I have mentioned very little about your background. And so I would appreciate if you take a little bit of time to tell us about yourself, how you got involved in groundwater management and in water markets generally. In terms of who you're talking to, this is so there are 3 groundwater sustainability agencies that have jurisdiction over various parts of the Kaweah Subbasin. And together, the GSAs have partnered, and there is a water marketing strategy committee that includes representatives of the GSAs, representatives of growers, irrigators, representatives of disadvantaged communities, and environmental water users, all represented here. And they have been tasked with designing a set of recommendations for a water marketing strategy to be implemented in each of those GSAs. That will get a thumbs up or thumbs down vote from the individual regulatory bodies. So that's sort of who's here. There's also some folks from the public. These are public open meetings.
Yeah, okay, sure. Would you like me to just introduce myself and then talk through the topics that we discussed, Matthew?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah, great. Well, well done on embarking on this journey in the project. It sounds really exciting. I am a bit of a water market tragic. I've been working as an economist and a consultant economic advisor for the last 20 years for a number of firms. And in 2012, started my own company with a couple of other colleagues. We've since grown. Aither is our company to around about 50 people operating in Australia and internationally. We work across the water sector, water policy, water infrastructure, but particularly on water markets. We work with both governments to help design and review water markets, particularly in the Murray-Darling Basin, but all across Australia and increasingly internationally. And we also work with water market participants, so agricultural water users, investors, environmental water holders, cities and towns that hold water rights in Australia to help them manage their portfolio of water rights and execute their kind of trading strategies to meet their needs. So we're an independent firm. We are an advisory firm. We don't have a stake in any water markets, those in Australia. So we pride ourselves on providing independent advice informed by evidence and analysis. I've got a few slides today, which I might share if that's okay, Matthew. Just need to work out. I'm not all overly familiar with.
There should be a share screen button in the bottom in the center, likely.
There it is. Can you see that now?
Yeah.
We need to make that larger.
Yeah, so just need to go to the full screen view.
Is that still showing it to you? Is that
Yeah,
showing you the
perfect.
full screen?
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, I've provided a bit of background around Aither and our water markets work and just who we are. What I'll cover very quickly today, based on discussion with Matthew and Craig, is a bit of an overview. We're jumping really down into the detail around Australian water markets and particularly those in the Murray-Darling Basin. There's a whole story of history and geography that could speak for days about, but Matthew's asked me to focus in on three key issues around market design. So those are the mechanisms for actually executing trades, price information and how that's disclosed, and third-party impacts and how they are managed. So I'll give you hopefully a bit of a warts and all view around a case study of how those things are done in the Australian water markets. That's not to say that's the best way, the only way. You guys obviously need to design something that's going to work for you and in your situation and given your history associated with water rights. Happy to take questions around it. I can't see all of you whilst this is on full screen, so just feel free to jump in and yell out.
Hey, and Chris, one thing we talked about, I hope you'll interweave into these three things, is you talked a lot about the importance of stakeholder buy-in and water user buy-in. You know that you have broad appeal among water users. So I hope you'll talk about that as you go.
Yeah, look, just as an overall comment, I think it's been a key success to the Australian water market reform journey, and a key distinguishing feature is that we started relatively small with localized markets, just focused on temporary trade in very confined areas, because people were concerned about third-party impacts. They didn't know what they didn't know. So they designed rules that were very constrained with trading, got experience, got user buy-in, and it actually became the irrigators and the users of water markets that started to demand greater freedoms in the trading, testing whether trade rules that were very restrictive could be relaxed without having third-party impacts. And that's actually been really critical to bringing people along on the journey of water markets. Maybe the downside of that is we've got something that hasn't been designed, perfectly from scratch. But I don't know that you're ever going to go from 0 to 100% with these types of things. They require significant change, and they have some significant impacts across a broad range of stakeholders. Look, I'll jump. I'm happy to touch base on that further. Market mechanisms. So this is to really explain just how trades are executed in Australian markets. I understand that you're thinking about how trades should be executed and what mechanisms should be available. Before I get into that, I think it's important to note that water markets in Australia are basically for two different products. One is what we call entitlements. That's the underlying and perpetual ongoing rights to receive a share of water in a system, whether it be a groundwater aquifer or a surface water system. And then allocation. And allocation is the actual water that is assigned to those entitlements, and that is tradable from a year-to-year, day-to-day perspective. So entitlements are generally bought as a long-term investment to underpin security for a property, whereas allocations are bought and sold to manage seasonal needs. So that means there's different demands on the markets for those different products, and different mechanisms are used for the trade of those different mechanisms, which I'll touch on a little more. So the way water markets and trading occurs in Australia, particularly in the Southern Murray-Darling Basin, is through, on the left-hand side, a range of different trading platforms or approaches that can be used. These all end up, regardless of the way that the transaction is executed, whether it be a related party transfer, which is just someone moving water between their accounts, bilateral contracts, so just two parties, two neighbours agree to do a trade, and they either sign a contract or some money is paid that is done just between the two of them and completely privately. We also have broker facilitated bilateral contracts. So brokers are very prominent in the really active markets within the Southern Murray-Darling Basin, less active in the smaller markets. Tenders are, some large entities use tenders to sell excess allocation usually. We can talk a little bit more about the pros and cons of those. And there are a tender is just where somebody would say they have a volume of water that they don't need. They advertise and put out on the market that they're running a process and seeking expressions of interest to sell that volume of water to one or more parties at the highest price. So it's often used by environmental water holders that might have large volumes of water for sale, and they need to demonstrate probity in their approach, and they don't like using brokers for various reasons. It's not a commonly used mechanism in Australia. It's mainly used by large environmental water holders. And then the last one is online exchanges and auctions, where you've got online platforms where you can bid for and buy water parcels and everyone can see that the trading activity. So a key thing for Australia is we have all of these things working at the same time, and the way that we account for that water trade is through state water registers. So regardless of the mechanism used on the left-hand side, it will always end up in a form that relates to the transfer of water from one account to another. Those forms also, this links to the next topic, have price information requirements. So on the form, you are meant to disclose the price of that trade. But obviously it's separate from the contracts, and it is open to a number of reporting issues that I'll talk about soon. So those state water registers, and I can show you an example, process the trades, approve the trades, ensure that they can that they're appropriate and that they meet the trade rules, and then they update the individual water accounts and the amount of water available to that individual. So after that trade, those state water registers, because the Murray-Darling Basin covers multiple states, there are regulations in place for that state-based reporting to then be provided to federal government agencies, who then report on it publicly, and the state agencies report directly from those registers as well.
Chris, this is Aaron Fukuda with the local GSA and irrigation district. As you process that pricing information through the state water registers and then out for public reporting, is that just self-regulated as far as the price? Is there any follow-up that, what if you said the agreement is over here on the left and how do we know that the pricing information is correct as you move to the right?
Yeah, so you don't, and there's very little enforcement and follow-up, and it has been one of the challenges with water market information. Our Australian Competition and Consumer Commission did a major review of water markets over the last couple of years. I can send you a link to that report where they looked into these details around the accuracy of price information. There's also a range of issues around the nature of the trade. So I think it's over 50% of what's called trades are actually transfers between related parties. So it's just people moving water around between their accounts, but it looks like a trade. It comes through at $0, and everyone says, well, what are these $0? What are these $0 trades? And what's this rubbish here around the price information? So Aither and other companies, we have a number of filtering methods and tools that we use to kind of make sense of the data and kind of know the story behind the data. Governments are also starting to report reasons for trade. So there might be, I'm trying to think of a good example. There's some complicated transactions like leases or carryover contracts that might have a good reason for appearing at a price that's not the market price. And so what they're doing there is labeling that this was a transaction associated with a lease or a carryover transaction. So they're labeling the type of transaction so people can understand why that price might differ from the prevailing market price.
Thanks, Chris.
So I'll just run through some of the pros and cons and exploration of these items in a little bit more detail. So related party transactions, as I mentioned, that's generally the same owner moving parcels around their different properties for different reasons. I mean, it's all they need to do is fill out a form. They can do that online actually without even filling out a paper form in many states. So they've got an account, a login, and they can move water between their accounts. But in Australia, that comes up, it's a transfer, but it comes up the same as a trade, and it appears on the register as a $0 movement of water. Bilateral contracts, as I mentioned, informal agreements with, informal agreements between individuals. Sometimes they would have a contract, other times they wouldn't. What is you speak to some of the old guys who were around in the 80s and 90s when water trading started to kick off in Australia, and they would say that, you know, we used to sell our excess water for a slab of beer. It was very, very informal, and some of that still exists today. And I think part of the benefit of those types of arrangements is that there's no broker costs involved. People can build long-standing relationships with counterparties that they trust and know, and work with in the same as any other commercial transaction. The other part of that is that many of these bilateral contracts and sometimes the entitlement trades, the trades of the underlying rights, are bundled transactions of water and land for a total price, and it's very hard to distinguish between, well, how much are they paying for the land versus the water. Our reporting tries to force people to do that, but in reality, they're doing a transaction overall, but the land and the water transactions need to get disclosed. So obviously price disclosure is more of an issue with these types of contracts, and the transactions themselves are not accessible to everyone in the market. They may not be getting the best deal because they're not testing it across the market. Brokers, so brokers are probably the main mechanism that are used for people to execute trades, particularly in the Southern Murray-Darling Basin, which is a really active market. There's a number of brokerage firms, and then there's also a number of very small firms or people linked to real estate agencies that will act as water brokers, and their job is effectively to bring buyers and sellers together to find buyers and sellers, and bring them together to get the best price for their clients. So some of the advantages of that are around anonymity of the sellers during process, if you want to be anonymous, the use of standard contracts that they will have, and they will also use a facilitated kind of settlement process where they will hold money in trust accounts and to ensure that it's settled and approved, and manage some of that counterparty and contracting or settlement risk. But there are also challenges with brokers. You're only getting to their network. There's many of them operating. There are inefficiencies associated with, many parties might need to contact multiple brokers to try and get the best deal. They don't have visibility to everything. It's kind of inefficient in that way. But the main issue that has emerged in Australia over the last decade or so is just trust issues with broker conduct. There is almost no regulation of broker conduct in the market, and that has been the subject of this major inquiry over the last couple of years, run by our Australian Consumer and Competition Commission, which has basically recommended that brokers should be regulated, and the Broker Association itself agrees with that because they don't want the cowboy operators out there making a bad name for everyone else. But look, generally, most trades there are trusted brokers out there. Most trades and most people, there's competition in the market, so if people do the wrong thing, they quickly get a name for it. So experienced traders would know which brokers to avoid and which ones they can trust and work with well. So it generally works. 95% of trades would work well through brokers, and it's just the small minority that can kind of create issues and make broader problems. Tenders, as I mentioned, it's a very infrequently used mechanism, basically where a large water holder will have excess water available, and they will go out and advertise, call for expressions of interest to sell that water. So they're avoiding using a broker. They can make sure that they see all of the bids, and they can satisfy any procurement or probity requirements that they may have, typically as government agencies doing this selling, that they have been non-discriminatory in their processes. They've not just kind of picked their favored parties to trade with, and they can, if they've advertised widely, can kind of justify that they've got the best price and the best value for money for often what is an asset held by a public agency. But those tenders are pretty inefficient, inflexible, time-consuming processes that you wouldn't want to be using for small transactions or individual irrigators making 1 or 2 transactions a year. And then the final one, online exchanges and auctions. These work really well. In Australia, they are what they sound like. There are online platforms where people can go and bid for parcels of water. They work in different ways. There are some auctions that are time bound. Generally, that's for entitlement parcels. So it's like eBay, basically, for water entitlements. There are others where there are just buy and sell or buy and sell spread, and anyone could come in at any time, see the sell offers, and agree to buy that water, and the exchange goes through straight away. There are different platforms. Part of the challenge in Australia is that there's probably 3 or 4 of these different platforms. So there are issues there around the fact that there's just not one single market, which makes it hard for people to know what's going on at any particular time, get that single source of truth. That has really undermined, the lack of a single source of truth has really undermined water market confidence in Australia, and that was a major finding of the ACCC as well. So the good things about online exchanges is buyers and sellers are anonymous until deal struck. They're accessible, transparent. Some of the cons are the risk that trades fall over after a deal. This happens occasionally. It's also a bit of a risk of fake parcels or fake bids. Sellers putting bids in on their own water to bid the price up, etc. There's not a lot of monitoring around that, and as I mentioned, the inefficiency of as a market participant to have to monitor multiple platforms to see what's going on across the whole market. Does anyone have any comments or questions on that?
Couple of questions. So this area is quite large that you're exchanging water. Are there limits on the distance that this water can be traded? Do you have regions that it has to stay within, or can it go anywhere across your entire region?
And you might distinguish between surface and groundwater for us.
Yeah, so that's a whole nother area of that we could probably spend another hour or so on. And I'll get to it a bit in terms of the management of third-party impacts.
Just briefly, are there restrictions?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, water is a physical commodity, so the market has to match the physical realities of the system that it's operating in. So for groundwater, we have defined groundwater management units and sometimes zones within those groundwater management units, which are geologically connected resources, and work has been done to ensure that they are connected, and we draw lines on around where trade can occur and where trade can't occur. Sometimes if trade is, or if water use is very intensive in particular subcomponents of a zone, they will, and there's concern about localized drawdown, will design rules to allow water to move out of those zones, but no more to come in, because they're worried about the intensity of use in a particularly small subzone. So yes, those zones are used extensively across Australia, and the groundwater management units are relatively small compared to the surface water units, where we have rivers that will run for thousands of kilometers. But even there is and this is where I talked about before, the starting small, starting within your defined reach and allowing trade between the reaches, and then progressively designing rules to link up trade across hydrologically connected systems, which in the three main rivers in the southern Murray-Darling Basin are the Goulburn, the Murray, and the Murrumbidgee. They all meet at a particular point, and there are trade rules, complicated trade rules. I can show you of where you can trade water in and out to. They close and open at particular times based on climatic and water availability conditions. So there are complex rules that govern that and to manage third-party impacts, and it's a really critical area of water market design. Does that make sense?
Yes. What, just as a kind of for understand, how expensive is an acre foot of water typically for groundwater in Australia?
For the permanent right, or just the annual allocation of actual water? Yeah. So annual water, it would vary from about $20 per megaliter up to $400 or $500 per megaliter. Could someone do the calculation to acre foot?
He's working on it right now.
What was the price again? So we divide by 0.8 to get the new price. So 400 divided by 0.8.
Divided by 0.8. 500. That's Australian dollars.
That's Aussie dollars. So yeah, times it by 0.7 to get to US dollars. So if it was $400 per megaliter, that would be that would be in relatively dry times, and that would push the limits of most water using enterprises, like particularly cotton and broadacre enterprises.
And I remember reading National Water Commission reports from earlier in the millennium, where it was substantially higher than that. It was more like $1,200 to $1,300 an acre foot, as opposed to 800.
Yeah,
so the price moderated over time.
No, it's gone up overall. It's just that the climatic variability is the big driver. So during extreme drought conditions, the market price can change dramatically. So in 2019, the market price for surface water hit $1,000 per megaliter. 3 years of drought, storages were low. Now it's about $50 per megaliter, because we've had 2 years of La Nina conditions, wet. I don't know if you can see behind me, you can't really. Sydney getting rained on substantially, which it has been for the last 6 months. So the price does vary dramatically with water availability.
So that's about 2,000 an acre foot in 2019.
Hey, Chris, question for you is, first of all, thank you so much for doing this from Sydney, Australia.
No worries.
Which we planned on coming your way. It didn't work out though.
And plane tickets are really expensive right now.
Yeah, travel's restricted. Yeah, COVID, especially me. So how is the verification if a grower sells a 200 megaliters to another grower? How do you provide that confirmation that, okay, he sold it, he bought it, and then he didn't use it? Because like out in California, these are remote areas where buying and selling could happen, but how do you verify that the water isn't being used and is being used?
Or how do you monitor water use?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it'll come, so the trade is executed on paper. So the water moves from an account, someone's account to another person's account. I could show you the Victorian Water Register. So everyone has like a bank account, an online bank account, and the water moves between one account and another. And then on the ground, people are individually metered and monitored. So all extraction from groundwater systems and surface water is metered. Most of it is telemetered as well. So you'll have daily usage uploads to the water register system that will debit people's accounts. So as they're debited, once they get to zero, or even before they get to zero, compliance action will start. So the local authorities will be monitoring those accounts, and they will turn up and start prosecuting you if you go into negatives.
In that commission report, did they find quite a bit of that kind of, I'm selling it, but I'm using it at the same time for not much?
No. I don't. Look, there have been instances of theft or overuse, whatever you want to call it. There is also the metering is in some systems in the northern Murray-Darling Basin. The metering hasn't been fully implemented yet, but in the southern basin where the market is the most active, everyone's pretty much got meters. And yeah, compliance is taken very, very seriously. And it's been a major, we've had a few exposures of water theft that have become big media events. And it has put a lot of attention of governments on compliance, making sure that we get accurate meters in place. Yeah, the telemetry is being rolled out progressively to get those daily usage uploads. So it's not just waiting for the irrigator to self-report from their meter reading, 2 months late, how much water they used. So it's, the water market wouldn't work without good compliance.
And is there any satellite remote sensing or talk about implementing remote sensing?
It's used, but not for measuring extraction from a compliance perspective.
Okay.
How is it that they can afford these high prices? What kinds of commodities are they trying to, I would assume, preserve? It's permanent plantings, I would assume, because with the typical plantings of the grains and sorghums and things like that are grown in a lot of that region there, they can never afford those water prices.
Yep. So it's not always that high. So you're right. So rice is probably the lowest dollars per megaliter. So around $100, $150 per megaliter. The rice growers can make stack up. Dairy farmers and pasture growing, it's kind of $250 to $300 per megaliter. Cotton, pretty similar. Cotton, and it all moves around with commodity prices. Cotton prices are very high at the moment, and they tend to be the industries that are flexible and can turn off. And during dry conditions, like when it was $1,000 per megaliter, they just all turned off. Any water that they did get allocated, they were better off selling it to the permanent horticulturalists, the almond growers, wine grape growers, citrus, table grapes, who could afford to pay the $1,000 a megaliter, even if it was just to keep their long-lived assets alive, and they weren't making much money in those times. It gets them through, and that's what we've seen. That's been probably the big success of the Southern Murray-Darling Basin water market. Is we've got huge variability in supply. During those dry times, water has been able to move to keep those horticultural developments going, and everyone better off. And then when it's wet, the rice growers, the cotton growers can expand and yeah.
Hey, and David just pointed out in a chat that I implemented the exchange rate incorrectly. You said 0.7. I thought it was 1.7. And so So if it was 850, so if it's 500 Australian dollars, and you said it went up to about 1,000, was that the most?
Yeah, so 1,000 Australian dollars would be about 700 US.
Okay, which is about 1,500, about 1,400 to 1,500
That's per megaliter.
dollars per acre, but at the peak.
Yeah.
So not 2,000, I said 2,000.
So I'll just keep going quickly. I'm happy to keep answering questions, but just generally assessment of the kind of current arrangement. So the state registers really do work well. There are quite a lot of benefits of the state staying out of the commercial transactions. They don't want to see all of the contracts and all of the different arrangements that are in place. It puts an additional burden on what are effectively water regulators, not financial regulators. Lots of work has been done to increase trade processing and approval speeds. So you can pretty much go through those hurdles of those rules of, can I move my water to this person at a click of a button. However, as I mentioned, the price and commercial information is inevitably imperfect when you have that separation of the trading platform and the registration process. Particularly, we only get information through the registers post the trade being done and the deal being executed and registered. We don't get any of that pre-trade information, the buy-sell spreads, et cetera. Brokers can play a valuable role reducing transactions costs and understanding approvals processes. Many of them work as advisors as well as brokers, but they're not fully available across all the systems, and there are trust and misconduct and cost issues that go along with it. And as I mentioned, online exchanges work well, but don't tend to get a lot of the throughput in the water market. So the core challenge in the Australian water market setting, particularly in the Southern Murray-Darling Basin, is this patchwork of mechanisms that are not connected commercially, that's creating transactions costs for participants, confidence issues, and that imperfect pre and post-deal information. But it's not too bad, I would say, overall. So what I thought I'd give you a bit of an example of what information is made available on the Victorian Water Register. So you can see, I've given you a link. You can go in and jump into that water register and have a look at it. So basically, what happens with price information on these registers is that all trades and transfers are shown publicly once the deal is registered, which means it's approved. The data is anonymous, so you see individual trades, but you don't see who bought and sold. There's quite a bit of noise in the data, as I mentioned before, those $0 trades. You can see here, this is a list of the last lot of trades from 15th of July this year in the Goulburn system. You can download and export these. We scrape these websites to get all of the trade info. You can see here that there's a lot of transfers at prices of $0. They are just transfers, not proper trades. And you can see the prevailing price of $65 per megaliter. So I'm going through at 70. That one there is probably a lease or a forward agreement that was agreed a year or two ago, and it's going through the register now. And so you've got to kind of understand the data, and this is some of the imperfections that are there with it. There has been pushes for greater transparency around individuals and their account information, but a lot of pushback from users who don't want effectively their bank account and their transaction history made publicly available for everyone to see. And I think there's some pretty legitimate concerns about that, including where we've got brokers who will cold call people and say, you look like you're short of water, can I go and get you some for you, etc. So there's a lot of concerns around that, and I think pretty unanimous agreement not to go down that path of publishing individuals' private details. We've done a lot of work on improving approval times, but there are still delays on entitlement trades. So that means that once entitlement trades are registered, the contract date may have been, several weeks prior. So the market price may have moved during that time. There are ways to get around that and get an understanding of current market prices, but for entitlement trades, you've got to know that there's a bit of delay in the registration of that information. It also has created difficulties in investigating market conduct. So the ACCC, when they looked at the water market conduct, they actually had a lot of problem in investigating whether any parties within the market who were accused of potentially misusing market power, it was very hard for the ACCC to demonstrate or assess whether they were or they weren't. There's problems with that both ways. One of the bigger problems is that people can just make unsubstantiated claims about, certain parties' conduct, and it impacts the whole confidence of the market, and it may just be complete rubbish. And we've had instances of that. Probably had more instances of false accusations than anything actually wrong. And I think that the final point there I'll make is that we often harp on about the value of good price information. It actually increases the value of water rights across the system. We work with agricultural investors, and they will go to systems where there is good price information on water rights, and they will value those systems higher than having to deal with uncertainty of systems where there's opaqueness around the value of water rights. So there is benefits for everyone in having good price information out publicly.
And Chris, here, there's a lot of concern in California about the role of investors. So people who don't hold allocations because of the land they own, being allowed to transact in markets, and driving high price volatility. Do you want to just address those concerns?
Yep. So look, in Australia, in the Southern Murray-Darling Basin, as I mentioned before, we started the market in a very confined way, and water trading was only available for people who held land, lived within irrigation, held land within particular irrigation districts. There were limits on how much water entitlement could be owned by any one particular party. So we started with a number of those regulations to manage that issue. Over time, a number of assessments had been done, including by the National Water Commission, around whether we were seeing concentration of market power, and gradually many of those constraints were lifted. We do now have a number of parties who are water investors, so they will come and buy entitlements and then generally lease those entitlements back to farmers for a rate of return. Typical lease rates are around 3 to 5% of the value of the water entitlement, and that's been proven to be a pretty useful. There's certainly some benefits of that type of model, including for water users who can't afford, who want to come into the market, can't afford, or come into irrigation, but can't afford to buy water rights. So I think everyone's going to make their own decisions about how open they want their market to be and who can participate. I'm not kind of judging it either way. There have been concerns raised about some of the conduct of those investors, or whether they should be allowed to own entitlements. But the other phenomenon that we've seen a lot of is that many irrigators, small family farming enterprises who will retire from irrigation, perhaps sell their land but keep their water. So effectively their pension fund is their water entitlement, and they keep playing the water market. And there's quite a big cohort of those people as well. So Then you start to raise questions around, well, should they be allowed to keep hold of their water if they're no longer an irrigator? So this question around like who is an investor becomes pretty important and a bit fraught.
Is that, what is the base allocation of water and groundwater across that valley? How much per acre or per hectare?
Oh yeah. So a lot of that volumetric, we don't really do it that way anymore. So a lot of those rights were initially provided on a deemed volume per hectare, and it varied from probably 3 megaliters per hectare up to 12 megaliters per hectare. Sorry if we can do the conversions, depending on the zones, and some irrigators does that make sense?
Yeah, that's on the high end, that's a substantial amount of water.
Yeah. And then those the people that got that at the high end have generally become much more efficient over time and have basically had the benefit of a windfall gain, really, being able to sell their excess water either temporarily or permanently.
Sorry, how many megaliters per hectare was the high end?
12.
Okay, so that would be 12 divided by 2.5. Yeah, so that is quite a bit of water. Yeah,
that's for surface water, not ground. That's surface water.
Yeah, that's like 6 acre feet per acre.
But that process was done in the kind of 1980s, 1990s. It was a long time ago, and so now, like, you have to actually go and buy the water if you want to develop new areas of land. And there will be land that doesn't have any water. It's completely unbundled. So you have to, when you're buying a property, you have to look at, well, what water rights am I buying? What land am I buying? There may be irrigation properties that have been irrigated every year for the last 20 years, but they don't actually own any permanent entitlement. You've got to then go out and buy that separately, or just rely on the allocation market. So this chart just shows, despite some of the problems with price data, you can actually get a pretty good time sequence of water prices in the Southern Murray-Darling Basin. It's quite an active market, so we do get reasonable price information. Aither scrapes those state registers. We have our own filtering processes, so we can get volume weighted average prices on a weekly and monthly basis across all of the major zones. This shows the trajectory over the last couple of years. So November 2019, we were in dire straits, 3 years of drought. Prices hit $1,000 per megaliter in the lower Murray trading zone, which is where all the permanent horticulture is. And then from there, we've shifted into a La Nina cycle, and the prices just dropped substantially over the last couple of years. We just tend to go through these cycles of wet and dry, and the market tends to work. At the moment, the cotton growers and the rice growers are all gearing up. Cheap water. They're going to have a really cracking summer this summer, whereas back in 2019, everyone was just pulling back and just trying to survive. This kind of shows entitlement. I thought I'd put this out there just to show that the price information can become a bit patchy when we start doing volume weighted average prices. You can see there's some discontinuities in this data, and there's just not enough data to get a good price trend from the register data. It's one of the issues that kind of comes up in the way that people do analysis. In relation to third-party impacts, and I'm conscious we're kind of covering a lot of ground here. The main ways that we manage third-party impacts, mostly those impacts, when you look at them, they're not related to the financial trade. They're related to changes in the timing location, and the nature of extraction and use. That's what causes potential third-party impacts. So we try and manage those changes in the actual physical movement of water with trade rules or with different mechanisms. So we have rules on extraction and use at a site that are separate from a water access rights. So this is really important for groundwater and that issue of localized drawdown impacts. In most of the Australian groundwater systems, if someone comes in and wants to dig a new bore, an assessment will be done to say, are you within 500 meters or 1 kilometer of any other bores? And if you are, it will likely be refused, and you can't sink that bore because of the concern of localized drawdown. So this is completely separate from the water market. That person could buy water access entitlements, but they don't have the right to extract from a new bore until they've gone through an approvals process to assess whether that's within the zone and whether they're not going to have any adverse localized drawdown impacts on their neighbours.
But on existing bores.
Yeah, existing bores. Yeah.
So there are even limits on existing bores, whether or not they can pump it out of an existing one.
Correct. Yeah. So in an existing bore, you might have 2,000 megalitres of water entitlement, but your bore might only be licensed to extract 1,000 megalitres per year, and that's all you can extract. And there may be conditions around daily extraction limits or other conditions around the timing and the extraction. Yeah. So that's all managed separately from the actual water access entitlements and allocations. That's all about your right to use and extract water is separate, and so those approvals need to be done separately.
How deep is a typical bore, or is there such a thing?
Yeah, no, it varies. So we have shallow aquifers, which are 20 meters to
30 meters,
10 to 30 meters, and then deep aquifers that might be up to a couple of 100 meters.
Okay.
But I think one thing that I would say, just speaking more generally, is that during the 80s and 90s, groundwater levels in Australian groundwater systems were declining substantially. We put in place a range of measures like your Sigma to bring them back to within sustainable extraction limits. We introduced metering and compliance, and yes, that was hard yards and tough for many people to reduce their overall levels of extraction, but we've now stabilized groundwater levels, in many cases improved them, and got the situation in place where the groundwater rights are really valuable, they're tradable, and the groundwater levels are stable, and yeah, people have confidence that the water's going to be there.
So for that third one, Chris, obviously there's two approaches. Some water users would prefer greater flexibility, fewer restrictions, and then an adaptive approach to implement restrictions as unintended consequences are revealed. Another approach is to start small, be very limited, and then relax those limitations over time. Do you want to speak to that, why it was done this way, and if there's any lessons there?
Yeah, I think it was done this way because people were concerned. They didn't know. They didn't think they could design everything, and it's probably hard to. Maybe they felt like it was hard to ratchet things back if it didn't work. And water is such an important resource that they decided to err on the side of caution. Start small, build confidence that it works and delivers benefit, and then go from there. I guess part of the problem with that is you tend to have a bit of a hodgepodge or a patchwork of different things connected together. So our Southern Murray-Darling Basin market is kind of things are connected together, and we've gradually got to go and harmonize and make it all consistent, which takes time and inefficient. But I don't think we would have got people over the line with designing a multi-jurisdictional water market from scratch.
Yep. Okay.
Yeah, so I think the other kind of, that first one I mentioned, trade zones and limits on movement between zones is really important. Yeah, and as I mentioned earlier on, we had limits on ownership, which are really aimed more at kind of the social and public perceptions, as opposed to and potentially some of the kind of more economic and financial elements of changes in ownership and use, and managing that carefully, as opposed to specific or third-party impacts. And then the last point is that you've got to keep reviewing the science and making water plans and the systems of rules that are based on best available science, and we've had to adjust those over time. The big topic at the moment in Australia is around the impacts of climate change and what that means for our ability to achieve environmental and public benefit outcomes, and whether that needs further changing of the rules.
Is it perceived that there's a tension between trading and the environment, or is there evidence that water markets produce environmental benefits as well? And you talked about environmental users. Who are those users, and why do they participate in the market?
Yeah, so when we did the National Water Commission assessment of the social, economic, and environmental impacts of water trading, was when back in 2008. It was pretty clear at that time that water trade, it was coincidental that water trading was tending to move water from upstream zones to downstream zones, and the aggregate impact of that was providing environmental benefits. There are, however, instances more recently where we've had trade rules in place, say, to move water from one system to another. They've actually been too liberal, and they have created negative environmental impacts of pushing large volumes of water through river systems during summer. We've had to come and change those trade rules. So it's not trade itself; it's the rule has not been appropriate for the environmental constraints that it's been within. There probably is a bit of a general skepticism amongst environmental groups around the merits of water markets, but we also have a number of impact investors that are using some of their water on wetlands, for example. The main environmental water holders are actually government agencies. So when we went through the major process of shifting the balance from excessive water use to back within sustainable limits, we created state-based and a federal environmental water holder. And they actually, in Australia, the government bought back rights from water users to address that balance. Those water rights are now, they have the same characteristics as irrigators' water rights, and they're held by a government agency called the Commonwealth Environmental Water Holder. So they can use that water to meet environmental objectives through the system. They can also sell water where it's in excess to what they need at a particular time. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Those purchases, were they mandated or were they voluntary?
Voluntary, yeah. So willing sellers, yeah, all voluntary. So just I thought I'd need to sum it up in some way. I think there's a number of lessons learned. We talk for hours about this stuff. As I mentioned before, I think there are big benefits to be gained from sustainable management water resources and the flexibility that water markets can provide, and getting in place good arrangements as opposed to perfect, and starting to work with those, get used to it is really important lesson. It's a big change, and kind of gradually introducing people to these concepts, building up the knowledge and capacity is really important. The fact that you're all in the room, whether virtually or not, shows that you're kind of interested in it. But I'm sure, like in Australia, there is probably a whole cohort of your colleagues who are water holders who aren't in the room, who will be skeptical, and you need to get across the line. Otherwise, they're probably gonna kind of continue to be skeptical, continue to not be as informed, and therefore that can kind of create problems. So, you know, getting on with it is kind of about bringing people along is really critical. Don't be complacent. I think we got a bit complacent about water markets in Australia. Thought it was pretty good, thought the job was done, and then got a lot of backlash around investors, around where prices got to during droughts and what the cause of that was. And I think we've gotten pretty complacent about the need to continually, one, champion the benefits of water markets and what they can achieve, but also continually improve and respond to stakeholders' concerns. The last point there is kind of, as I was talking about, you know, the water market just becomes life for water users. It becomes part of the things that you've got to understand. You know, you've got to understand commodity prices, you've got to make choices about what you're going to grow. When you've got a water market, you've kind of got to understand the you know, the price of water, how it's trending, what's going on. It's just another thing for growers in particular to understand. It's a great quote from an irrigator that I know in Mildura, who just said, you know, if you don't understand the water market and you're an irrigator, you might as well just be playing golf, because it's just so important to you, it becomes so important to your business. So look, that's just probably a couple of things that are top of mind. Yeah, wish you well with your journey. It's really interesting stuff. And yeah, happy to take some further questions quickly, or if I do have to head off pretty soon to a meeting, and it's probably taken up more time than yeah, was intended. But happy to come back again if there's anything further.
Well, Chris, on behalf of the group here, I think I do want to extend my appreciation of your time and your thoughtful presentation here. I think you've piqued the interest of many, right? As you're doing this every day, and we're just starting, right? I harken back to this is when my wife and I are getting ready to have our kid. We're scared half to death. You know, we've got the car seat sitting in the box in the living room, and we're like, how do you put this thing together? So I think there's a lot of questions we have, and I think in the future, you know, we'll maybe be following up with you on future discussions. But thank you so much.
Hey, Chris, I have one quick question. Is that one of the questions we're confronting is, should we start with one system, one mechanism for transfers, or should we allow multiple to compete? And what's your view of that in thin markets, right? When you're first starting out and people still learning the culture of trading and the mechanics of trading, can multiple market mechanisms coexist in thin markets?
Look, it's probably a question that you could probably do a lot of detailed analysis and thinking about. Off the top of my head, I would say that having one market is probably the best way to go as you're getting started. And if it's ultimately going to be relatively small and there are going to be limited numbers of buyers and sellers, I think there's a lot of benefits of that, of being able to integrate from the start the market platform with the registry arrangements and having it all in one place. It would help address a number of issues that we have. My only concern around that would be, can you enable trusted counterparties to undertake bilateral agreements on such a platform if they have a long-standing relationship or a relationship of trust or whatever. I know that gets into probably some murky territory. That's my only.
No, I understand. Great, that's valuable. Thank you.
Chris, one question for, it sounds like your marketing platforms sells both groundwater and surface water entitlements. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Do the buyers and sellers, are they trading both, or are they kind of treating it as a water supply portfolio?
Depends on what access they have. So some irrigators will have access to surface water and groundwater, and they can use a portfolio of both to meet their needs. Others, just based on their location, will only have access to surface water or only have access to groundwater.
So in the periods of drought, people are selling more of their surface water entitlement then, or are they selling their groundwater?
During droughts, groundwater usage tends to increase a lot. So there's a lot of people will use, if they have access to both, they'll use surface water most of the time and when it's wet, and underuse their groundwater and basically save it up for use during dry times. And we have arrangements called carryover, where you can actually carry over some of your groundwater allocation from one year to the next. So you can kind of save it up and use it during the dry times, and then rely on the surface water during wetter times. Obviously, the pumping cost is a big component of that. You're probably talking, most groundwater users would say $60 to $80 per megaliter of groundwater pumping costs, whereas the surface water is often kind of right at your door and you don't only have to lift it. If you have to lift it at all, it's not very far.
You know, Chris, that brings up a good question. Does your system allow for groundwater recharge to, it sounds like your entitlement program defines the amount that you get annually, but what happens if a elaborate grower or even these larger corporations can then put excess, right? So they're taking excess and putting it in the ground, or is all water in Australia got a name on it? Meaning, is there no such thing as excess?
I think generally that's probably the answer. There's no such thing as excess. We don't really do managed aquifer recharge in Australia. We don't. It's done a little bit for cities and towns, but we don't have the regulatory. We don't have the rights arrangements for someone to re-inject or recharge an aquifer and then maintain ownership of that water that they re-inject. If you did re-inject, it would just be socialized across everyone.
Interesting. Yeah, it sounds like the way your entitlement system was structured was on a defined allocation. And if I want to do groundwater recharge, I simply have to go buy it from somebody else to put it in the ground.
Yeah.
Awesome. Hey, well, Chris, with your permit, first of all, thank you so much for joining us. This was really, really interesting. With your permission, if there's follow-up questions from committee members, can I send follow-up questions in an email?
Yeah, sure. No worries. And yeah, as mentioned, happy to re-engage as you're working through this journey. If it's helpful. I'm not the best parent, so probably better at water markets than parenting. It's hard.
How about I bring my kid to Sydney and we'll see how good I'm doing.
If you can survive the flight, you're doing pretty well.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much. We really appreciate your time tremendously.
Yeah,
thanks,
Would
everyone.
it be possible? I had to get off for another meeting, and I would love to see the slideshow. Is that possible to get that forwarded? That would be super. I really appreciate it. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, thanks, Chris.
Okay, thank you. See ya.
All right. Be well. Thank you.
I think we're down to the last 4 minutes.
Yep. Yeah. So I guess before we try and just revisit the scenarios briefly, how useful is that? So we've been trying to contact somebody in the Mojave Basin, somebody in central Nebraska. Is it a good use of our time? You know, it takes 45 minutes to an hour out of each meeting to hear the experiences in other places and and to get the chance to ask questions. Is that a good use of time, or is it sufficient to just read about it in case studies and in the existing water market chapter? Would you like more of that, or should we be directing our attention elsewhere?
Some of our thoughts also in there was like for the in Nebraska was try to find a grower that's being actively participating in the market to have that person share their experience in the market in that area.
I can tell you that this is Sophie, I attended a 2-day seminar on Australian water marketing way before we even thought about it here. It was done in Kern County, I want to say 5 years ago. And the ability, and I missed this, and I'm so sorry, but to hear people talk about it and be able to ask questions on the spot rather than just reading about it, I think is critical. And I don't know how this one played out, but I sure came away from that 2 days with a lot of questions about water marketing in Australia. And things could have changed by then, but I would just say that that's a great use of my time. Thank you.
It's very interesting hearing, but I don't need to go through 5 interviews.
Okay. Or two more.
Yeah.
Okay, that's fair enough. Okay.
So, yeah, I mean, it doesn't hurt to hear what's going on. Back to like what we were looking at before Chris started. I think what Chuck and Craig kind of alluded to, that the model you were showing there from 2015, when the spigot gets turned down, that's going to completely change.
Yeah.
Right?
So and let me be candid with you. I have 2021 spring file.
Well, and that's okay. I'm just saying.
One of the things I want to do, I want to avoid is I don't want people to be defensive. You know, if I drop a pin close to, you know, who the rancher is, and we see, so that's why I deliberately chose something distant so we can just speak in hypothetical terms. We're going to need to graph some rules. What's the basis for those rules?
Yeah, but we could even use 2021.
It would be nice if we could look at that ourselves and then maybe come up with some relevant questions.
Yeah,
too.
great.
You know, if we could have those
2021 files.
And with overlaid with subsidence with some of the other things as well.
Great. Finish your thought. You were so too. Yeah.
So 2045.
Yeah.
When everything's allocated and balanced.
Yeah.
Then we could discuss like, well, maybe we should be traded in this area. But before that, it's just a guess of why you don't want to trade into an area.
Yeah, but I think what you got to be careful though is that then the natural response is, well, then you need to wait till 2045 to be trading, right? And so we have to navigate something in between.
Yeah, no, I get it. I guess I don't have an answer. I guess that's what I'm saying.
Well, what's tricky is this committee is going to have an answer.
Well, I think you probably should maybe consider safe trading initially. When I say safe trading, we set some sort of a distance.
Yeah.
Even though 3 miles may seem excessive in this area, 3 miles may seem irrelevant in another area.
Yeah.
But we may have to do that to set some sort of constraints or maybe set the constraints relative to the size of the management area. In other words, if this area is this large and it has, you know what I'm talking about, and it's very similar in its behavior, maybe that one could be, used, and maybe it can go to the peripheral within a mile or two from the borders of that, but not beyond that.
So one thing I worry about with distance, first of all, is that it means it's a computationally burdensome, because now every well, you have to know the distance to every other well. And then second, what if you are a grower who desperately needs a little extra water to finish a crop or to maintain a permanent crop, and there's nobody within 2 miles, but there's somebody within 2.2 miles, right?
Right.
So then buy-in to the whole thing falls apart, right? Yeah.
I thought the one point was interesting too, or was a good point, was movement of upstream, downstream.
Yeah.
Aquifer, which, kind of sometimes how we end up moving surface water.
Yeah. Yep.
We keep very close tabs on lost water and the movement of that too, associated with surface water.
Yep.
So sometimes the mileage constraint may not apply if you're moving in the.
Yeah, the other thing that's interesting here though is that,
but you like as we do with surface,
yeah,
maybe you have a component in there that then helps to offset that. Okay, so you need that extra 0.2 miles, for example. Okay, but then you're going to get 10% loss on
Yeah,
that. Or
sure.
something.
So we can consider those. So just since we don't have time to talk about it today, we'll pick this up next time, but I do want to just highlight some other examples, some other scenarios, just so you're aware of them. So here's a situation right here. This happens to be the East Kaweah. But what you see here is you actually have a user who's in an undistricted area, the darker yellow, and a districted area, the lighter yellow, right? So this is somebody who would hypothetically only have native yield, whereas this person would have native and imported, right? And so we need to think about not just what's the extent of trading and then what are the limitations of that, but what is traded, right? And then what can be traded between whom. And so that's a set that will suggest a set of rules about how trades, and again, the simplest one would just be to say, well, the only thing we're going to trade is native because everyone's got it. And that means no one can trade sell more than 10 inches because that's what the native is. We do then need to get a legal opinion from the attorneys that that's okay to do. Some other scenarios that we'll talk about next time, because I think they're interesting, is the issue of disadvantaged communities and environmental water users participating in the market. So Aaron will give more details about this in the future, but we have a situation here where TID is operating a basin, a recharge basin on behalf of the community of Okieville. Okieville just to the south of that recharge basin. And there is actually the possibility, if I understand correctly, Aaron, where Okieville can actually generate allocation through recharge that they sell to irrigators. An irrigator could actually pay to, maybe that's the environmental one. So Aaron, real quick, in 30 seconds, sort of what's the situation with these three?
Yeah, there's a potential there where if you've got a recharge basin for the benefit of the community, the irrigation district would be doing it on behalf of those landowners in the Okieville, but collectively as a community, they could be purchasing water to put into that, and under the current bucket system, be allocated those credits. Those credits could then be shared with neighboring farmers, generating revenue to support their ongoing needs.
And I remember you said it was about $55 a unit to put it in the ground. If the prevailing price is $250, they can be using that revenue to maintain infrastructure and that sort of thing.
Correct.
And then there's one other example that's interesting. The Sequoia Riverlands Trust has the ability, is recharging, and in this case can both take deliveries of water and recharge for itself, but could also operate as almost like a water bank. Could actually, a nearby irrigator could purchase water to be recharged in that basin and essentially pay the Sequoia Riverlands Trust a recharge fee, and then the credit would go to the irrigator, right? And so there's unique opportunities here for both environmental water users and disadvantaged communities, not only to not be harmed, but to benefit from market transactions in the region. So we'll talk about those scenarios next time that we meet in a month. We will also get from the GSAs the subsidence MTs, so we can look at those. And again, we're sort of now at the point where we're sort of standing at the edge of the deep end. And I know I've heard it, there's complexity in all of this. There's a whole range of options. Start maximum flexibility, minimum restrictions, start maximum restrictions, change over time. We're going to have to choose a starting point, and do that by incorporating input from everybody on the call. So that's where we're at. We want to start making decisions, laying out a strategy that could be adopted. So what do those rules look like? What do the structures look like? So we'll pick that up next time. Any thoughts or comments before we go? I've held you 5 minutes over already.
I just have one.
Yeah, please.
And it was presented to me by the rest of the board.
Yeah.
And that was that, well, the rules will be what we decide.
Yeah. Sure.
And so we have to make sure that we present a well-defined, plausible reasoning for them to adopt.
I agree. Absolutely. Yep.
Because they ultimately are going to make
thumbs up or thumbs down. Yep. Thumbs up, thumbs down, or go a different direction, right? Yep. You bet.
would probably help to get a better understanding of each GSA, what rules they kind of want to follow, at least in a general.
Yeah, yeah, and so I would, so Aaron, I assume that's the function of the GSA representatives on this committee, right? Is to gather that input from the GSAs? Is
Yeah,
that fair?
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And Joe, and for our GSA reps, we totally respect that. But I caution those boards to remember, we're trying to do this on behalf of everybody. And I can understand everybody wanting to take their stake in the ground, but let's do this together. Let's try and stick it out together. Because if we don't, okay, let's just all go set up our own rules then, right?
Yeah,
That's fine. That's fine.
But
yeah.
You understand that I'm one
Yeah, no,
person on that board.
Yeah.
Who actually doesn't even I have a seat that is at the will of the board.
Yeah.
You understand that, right?
Yeah. Well, I totally get that, but I think that I'll leave it at that for right now.
Yeah.
You hung on to the end, Aaron.
I did.
You bug on it?
No. You know what? Chris started, and I got so enthralled with his thoughtful step through what he was talking about. I told my other crew, I'm sorry, but I'll have to catch up because now I've got probably more work to do tonight.
All right. So any other parting thoughts? So we will obviously make this presentation as well as the meeting recap available, and we'll also be sending a communication about the next meeting. So thanks.
All right, I guess we're adjourned here too.
Yep. Thank you, sir.
David Carter.